Well, welcome everyone to Christian Formation at Church of the Redeemer here in Sarasota. We're beginning a new series with this session called Anglicans in Hollywood, comparing how some Anglicans have been depicted by Hollywood versus what they were really like in reality. And the Anglican in this first of the series is somebody you've heard a lot of, and it's Henry VIII, considered by many to be the greatest king uh, in English history. By Anglican, we mean we trace our denominational history, in this case the Episcopal Church, back to the 16th century and the 16th century Reformation, and then which included the establishment of the Church of England. And by Hollywood, I mean Henry VIII's depiction in films or movies, in made-for-television productions as well, and in any recently made cable television productions, and now, as we all know, made for internet productions. So there's a variety of sources where you will find some of these movies and films and TV productions. And second, by Hollywood, I mean productions in whatever media that are what we call entertainments. That is, the production is designed to entertain us, whether or not it is historically accurate in its portrayal of, in this case, Henry VIII and his times. And third, by Hollywood, I have chosen not to include serious documentaries. I did find three TV movie documentaries on Henry VIII, and they're all good, including one which is part of a series entitled Monarchy by the noted historian and broadcaster Dr. David Starkey. And I commend these to you, but for me, they're not Hollywood. They weren't created to entertain, and that's the title of this, Anglicans in Hollywood. Before I review a selection of, shall we say, Henry VIII in Hollywood, let me give some context to Henry VIII by a broad-stroked overview of selected dates in the timeline of his life. And we should remember, if any timeline of Henry VIII will show a great number of major events that changed the course of English history. Timeline for Henry VIII, for example, will show how a divorce from Catherine of Aragon led to the English Reformation, and this in turn led to the break from the Catholic Church in Rome, and eventually in the reign of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, which led to the establishment of the Church of England, where we trace our denominational ancestry. So here's a selected timeline of Henry. He was born on June 28th in the year 1491 at Greenwich Palace. He had an older brother named Harry, or pardon me, not Harry, but Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother. And Arthur married Catherine of Aragon in 1501 when Henry was 10 years old. But a year later, Prince Arthur died, and so Henry became heir to the throne. In 1509, Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, died on April 21st. And then on June 11th of that same year, Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. They had one child in 1516, Mary, and you know her as Mary, the Queen of England, for a few years. In 1531, Henry VIII became head of the church in England and Wales. And then this is why I enjoy this research so much, because of this next phrase. Became the head of the church in England and Wales as far as the word of God allows. Isn't that great? A restraint was issued in the year 1532, and this is the beginning of getting England changing into something other, religiously, something other than the Catholic Church. So in 1532, an act was passed by Parliament which stopped all but 5% of payments by senior clergy to the Pope, and it went into effect the next year. So that limits the control of the Pope because he's getting less money. In 1533, on January 25th, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. And the marriage between Henry and Catherine of Aragon, in that same year was annulled by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer. And Anne Boleyn was crowned queen on May 31st, and they had a child, Elizabeth, who we know as Elizabeth I, on September 7th. In 1535, two prominent church personages, John Fisher and Thomas More, were executed, and I'll say a little more about Thomas More a little later. On January 7th of 1536, Catherine of Aragon died. Anne Boleyn was executed in that year on May 19th, and Henry's next marriage to Jane Seymour quickly followed. She did not live very long. She died in October of 1537. 1538, first publication of the English translation of the Bible. In 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves in January. That was annulled in July. In 1541, Henry was made King of Ireland. 1542, Catherine Howard was executed, and he had married her in July of 1540, and she was executed 2 years later. And Catherine Barr, Henry's last wife, he married in July of 1543. And Henry died at age 57 on January 28, 1547. His reign as king had lasted for 37 years and 8 months. So, with that brief and selective overview of Henry's life, let's take a look now at Henry VIII in Hollywood. And by my count, there are at least 16 films or TV movies where Henry is the subject of the production or a main character. The first was a silent film made in 1911 entitled Henry VIII, and I want to show you a still photograph of that on my iPhone. This is from a silent movie, and I think you'll enjoy seeing this. And you can kind of tell the whole tenor of what the movie is going to look like, both in her expression, but especially in his. This is from 1911, a photo from a silent movie. So that was the silent film in 1911 entitled Henry VIII, and the most recent film where Henry VIII is the subject or the main character was in 2008, The Other Boleyn Girl. In addition, there are at least 6 films or TV movies in which Henry VIII is a supporting character. When Knighthood was in Flower, a silent film made in 1922, it was the first and the most recent film, or I guess it was made for television because I watched it, was Wolf Hall in the year 2015, which is based on the first 2 novels in the popular 3-novel trilogy by Hilary Mantel. The most famous of these early movies is without doubt The Private Life of Henry VIII, a 1933 production starring Charles Laughton as Henry. And this British film was the first non-Hollywood film to win an Academy Award, and Laughton won it as Best Actor in 1933. This film is also credited with creating the popular image of Henry VIII. And let me show you some photos of that, and then I'll say a little more about the popular image of Henry VIII. Here's a photo. The language is in Greek because it was posted in Greece, but it's a photo, a single shot photo suggesting what the movie is about. And you can see what the movie was about. You can tell by the expressions exactly what's going to happen. Here's a picture of Laughton, Charles Laughton, as Henry VIII. And you can see the stance, which is very famous, and many paintings and uh, many paintings in previous centuries, but also photographs of his stance, showing his power and so on. Let's see if I've got another one here. I guess those are the two I have from this. But this really first major movie on Henry VIII, as I said, created the popular image. And the popular image, which continues to this day really, that Henry VIII was a womanizer. He was fat, lecherous glutton, constantly eating turkey legs and tossing the bones over his shoulders because that was part of this movie. Although I was able to find out, although in the film Henry actually didn't eat turkey legs, he ate an entire chicken at a banquet. And just as a little footnote to this, thanks to this famous banquet scene, when Charles Laughton went out to eat for years afterwards, he was served whole chickens, but with no silverware. So this is great stuff, isn't it? However, to contrast that popular image of Henry, one of his biographers, historian Alison Weir, says this about that. As a rule, Henry did not dine in the great halls of his palaces, and his table manners were highly refined, as was the code of etiquette followed at his court. He was, in fact, a most fastidious man, and, for his time, unusually obsessed with hygiene. As for his pursuit of the ladies, there is plenty of evidence, but most of it fragmentary, for Henry was also far more discreet and prudish than we have been led to believe. These are just superficial examples of how the truth about historical figures can become distorted for the purpose of entertainment. And so it begins. Over the decades, a number of films and TV movies, and remember, all of them are entertainments, not documentaries, are portrayals of Henry's life, especially his 6 wives and his most outrageous acts and events in his life. These entertainment films and TV movies are artistic creations and therefore not bound to historical accuracy. One exception I found, which is an entertainment but also a serious drama, is the 1966 film, and I commend it to you, A Man for All Seasons. Robert Shaw played a hearty Henry, he's described as. Let me show you a picture of him. And you can see in that photo, and he is sitting in a chair, obviously, but he has a more serious demeanor to him, if you notice. This is not somebody who's out eating turkey legs and throwing them over his shoulder. That's Robert Shaw. That was a supporting role. The star who played the main role was Paul Scofield, who played the role of Sir Thomas More. A Man for All Seasons is a very good serious film, which I've always liked. It's about More's crisis of conscience, and the film script was developed from the play, which is based on the later years of Sir Thomas More. At this time, More was the Lord Chancellor of England, and he refused to sign a letter asking the then Pope to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And that's because she could not bear him a son. The annulment was sought because Catherine did not bear the son, and More also refused to take an oath of supremacy, declaring Henry to be the supreme head of the Church of England. As a result, of course, he was executed by Henry. In just a 3-year period, 1970 to 72, 2 BBC TV movies were released. In 1970, The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, which was a 6-part series and very successful. And in 1972, just a kind of a rewording, Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So this public fascination with Henry's 6 wives seems to never wane. I think we're about due to get another one. Now here's the famous rhyme that lets you remember the fate of each of Henry's wives in their order. The first was Catherine of Aragon, the second Anne Boleyn, the third Jane Seymour, the fourth Anne of Cleves, the fifth Catherine Howard, and the sixth Catherine Parr. And it's a little rhyme. I'll say it twice so you can memorize it. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Say it again. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So Catherine of Aragon, who incidentally was Spanish, was divorced. Anne Boleyn was beheaded, and Jane Seymour died. Anne of Cleves, he divorced. Catherine Howard, he beheaded. And his last wife, Catherine Parr, survived him. Well, what can we say then about Henry VIII as he really was in reality, but not as Hollywood has portrayed him? He was what I would call a Renaissance man, someone who was not only complex, but also multi-talented and with many interests. He was what some would also say bigger than life. And I want to show you some photos of Henry now. The first one is it's not taken, it's a photo of a painting is what it is. It's a painting from 1509, and Henry would have been 18 years old. And this is the what's said about this painting about him. There is a fiery power in his eyes, beauty in his face, and twin roses in his cheeks. So here's an 18-year-old Henry VIII. And look at the piercing eyes. That's what I noticed when I first saw this. Notice he has a long neck. His hair in this painting did not appear to be ginger, which was the color it was often described as. But that's him when he's 18 years old. Let me describe this before I show it to you. This will be when Henry was 29, 11 years later. He was considered a good-looking man. His complexion was fair, and as I just said, his hair inclined to ginger. He was tall, about 6'2", and at 21 years old, his waist was just 32 inches. His face was round, his neck long. When he was 29, when this painting was done, the Venetian ambassador described him as, quote unquote, much handsomer than any other sovereign in Christendom. So here he is at age 29. Now you can still see the piercing eyes. The beard and the hair appear to be the ginger color, which is often described. You can see he's filled out. His neck does not appear to be as thin as it was. And still, I think, a good-looking man for that time. Here's one from age 44, and I'll read, when he was 44, I'll read the caption. This is when he's in 1535, when he's 44. He's filled out and grown his beard. He displays his evangelical credentials. He holds a scroll inscribed, quote unquote, go ye all the world, and go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And you'll see a dramatic difference, I think, in his appearance this much later. Notice how he has really filled out. And the hair is pretty much still ginger, I think, but he still has those eyes. And then I wanted to show you this picture as well. This is called the Whitehall mural, and I'll show it to you in a second. But the two figures in the center are his father and his mother, and then below them, to his father's right, is Henry VIII, and to his mother's left is his wife in the year this was painted, which is Jane Seymour. And there's a pedestal there with you can't see it because it's not bright enough, but it's in Latin, and it describes both kings as being successful, but then a debate about which one was more successful. And there's a theory that Henry always had an inferiority complex compared to his father, and he was always trying to do better than his father. And you'll notice in the painting when I show it to you how Henry has been painted as being the prominent figure compared to his father, who is to his left. Let me get this a little better. I'll stand up with it maybe. There we go. This faded a little bit. Notice the stance of Henry, the very famous stance that there have been many paintings of. But he's clearly painted as the dominant between himself and his father. Henry was initially a defender of the traditional Catholic Church of his time. He even wrote a book entitled Defense of the Seven Sacraments, defending the Church against the charges made by the great German reformer Martin Luther. There were 20 editions of this book entitled Defense of the Seven Sacraments published, and as a result, Pope Leo declared Henry defender of the faith. And this was earlier on in Henry's career before the break with Rome became more and more severe. Henry was a musician and a composer. And I have a photo of his music that he wrote. And as you can see, he composed his own music. He came from a musical family, and he was probably the most gifted, it said. He played numerous instruments, the lute, the organ, other keyboards, the quarters, the flute, and the harp, and he had a good singing voice. He built an extensive collection of musical instruments over those 37 plus years. He had 78 flutes, 76 recorders, 10 trombones, 14 trumpets, 5 bagpipes, and some more instruments as well. He was an accomplished athlete in his youth. He threw javelin, he enjoyed hunting and archery, and even played tennis at the time. He was fluent in French, Spanish, Latin, and some Italian. He was also an accomplished horseman. He owned at least 200 horses, and he loved to joust from an early age, and he is described as an excellent jouster. In January of 1536, during a tournament in Greenwich, he was unhorsed by an opponent, and his armed horse collapsed on top of Henry. He was unconscious for 2 hours, and many feared he had died. A famous duke was sent to tell his wife what had happened. And it's likely that this fall exasperated an existing ulcer in his leg, or may have caused a varicose vein to burst and later became thrombosis. This injury to Henry led to problems in both legs, which helped lead to his tremendous bloated weight. His waist was 54 inches a year before he died. Some modern authors have also suggested brain damage as a result of the fall, leading to what some claimed at the time to be a change in his character. We can never really know that, and probably will never will. But that's a more modern theory of what this jousting injury caused. It's true he lived in a very extravagant life. He owned 50 palaces, more than any other English monarch. He also had a large tapestry collection. He owned 6,500 handguns, and he also owned 70 ships. So this leads me then to the dark side of Henry, the reality of Henry. He reigned for over 37 years, and over this time he became more and more ruthless in his governance. Two sources I read said that Henry was responsible for putting to death at least 20,000 people during that 37 plus year reign. Well, what I have touched on shows, in my view anyway, that Henry VIII really was bigger than life, and I've only touched on a few dimensions. I've avoided all the acts of Parliament and all the interactions between him and the Parliament and the barons and so on, because those things are so complex. Henry was a much more complex and interesting person than the popular image that Hollywood created. My main hope and purpose in this brief presentation is to, I hope, have whetted your appetite to know more about Henry, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are multiple movies you can watch. There are numerous biographies of Henry VIII, most of which are in the Sarasota and Manatee County library systems. And if any of you would like a list of the movies that I mentioned, please contact me, R.W. Strom, RWSTROHM at redeemersarasota.org. I'd be happy to send you a copy. I want to thank you for watching this brief presentation. And I believe the next Anglican in Hollywood will be none other than Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, and the last Tudor monarch. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.